All right, ladies and gentlemen, you've got one more very, very, very short slide of notes with two topics on it. One of them is slave codes, the other one is Lauda Equiano. Now, slave codes were laws made in the colonies to control the behavior and actions of slaves. Uh, this is often going to involve banning gathering in large groups or owning weapons, putting together an army for a slave revolt. Uh, Later, it will actually include forbidding you to teach slaves how to read and write. Now, there's some paternalistic or fatherly rationales to try to justify slavery you might hear in this class and in dialogue on the internet, where people argue that the slaves were better off as slaves. They were happier as slaves. They needed us to take care of them. They didn't know what they would do without us. Well, if it was that great, you wouldn't have to take guns away from them and worry about them killing you in the night, because that would happen occasionally. Slaves would rise up and kill their master families because slavery's terrible. So anyway, you need to know the word slave codes, or the term slave codes, because it's going to come up again and again. Next up, Olaudah Equiano. He's a man who claims to be born in Africa. He knows how to read and write, and he later purchased his freedom and became an anti-slavery writer, or an abolitionist. And that's a term that's going to come up again and again as people that are for slavery and against slavery, the abolitionists are against slavery, are going to fight with the pro-slavery forces. Now, Olaudah is unique because he claims to be from Africa. Now, some historians argue he was actually born in South America, but Olaudah wrote about his experiences, he claims, of surviving the Middle Passage, actually being transported from Africa to the New World and then being sold into slavery. And we don't have a lot of accounts written by slaves because, if you remember from the last video, actually, I think it was from this video, uh, slaves often did not know how to read and write because they weren't allowed to, or people didn't think it was important to educate them. So usually our accounts or our records of the slave experience are recorded by slave ship owners who are keeping records, or sometimes slave ship sailors who later became Christians and repented of being in the slave trade and then would document all the evils that they participated in to kind of draw attention to how wrong and wicked it was. But Olaudah is unique because he's writing as a slave, as a survivor of the slave trade directly, and then tells us firsthand either something he personally experienced or maybe something that someone else told him. But it's an oral history from the perspective of a slave, and that's rare in this period. So this is a primary source we don't often have. So I'm going to read to you these two passages. I would just like you to listen, kind of take it in, and think about the parts that are confusing to you as you try to summarize it. The first passage is taken, Olaudah's been captured, and he's kept by slave traders, another African tribe or country, and they are now selling him to Europeans on a slave ship. And he's being led out to the beach. It says, "The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea, and a slave ship, which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror when I was carried on board. I was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I were sound by some of the crew, and I was now persuaded that I had gotten into a world of bad spirits, and that they were going to kill me. Their complexions too differing so much from ours, their long hair and the language they spoke, which was very different from any I had ever heard, united to confirm me in this belief. Indeed, such were the horrors of my views and fears at this moment, that if 10,000 worlds had been my own, I would have freely parted with them all, to have exchanged my condition with that of the meanest slave in my own country." So, two of the more perplexing parts of this passage, I want you to think about and discuss what it means to be sound. Was it a hearing test? What were they talking about with making sure he was sound? And then secondly, at the end, what did he mean by exchanging his condition with that of the meanest slave in his own country? Did he want to be traded with an angry person? I would encourage you to think about how we use the word mean in mathematics. It's the same usage there that Olaudah is referencing. All right, the second passage that he's recorded here is he survived the Middle Passage, and on the Middle Passage, usually depending on the slave ship's strategy, and I'll talk about this later, 20 to 50% of slaves would die on the slave ship, and they would just throw the bodies overboard, and sharks would follow the ships. But Olaudah survived, and he's at market, and now he's experiencing being sold. So we were not many days in the merchant's custody before we were sold after their usual manner, which is this. On a signal given, as the beat of a drum, the buyers rush at once into the yard where the slaves are confined and make choice of that parcel they like best. The noise and clamor with which this is attended, and the eagerness visible in the countenances of the buyers, serve not a little to increase the apprehensions of the terrified Africans, who may well be supposed to consider them as the ministers of that destruction to which they think themselves devoted. In this manner, without scruple, our relations and friends separated, most of them never to see each other again. So as you discuss and write your summary on this passage, I would encourage you to think about how Olaudah describes the Africans being treated in the third line, and then how the Africans feel in the fifth line, and then what happens to them in the seventh and eighth line. Like, what's the particularly unscrupulous or bad part? Other than that, again, that's all I've got for you today. Make sure you get this done. I'll collect it tomorrow. And I'll stay after school today if you want to stay after for test prep, and Tuesday as well. So good luck on that, and I will see you later.